Most people fear being hated, but few ever consider the minds of those who hate everyone. Beneath the cold indifference and quiet rage lies a psychology carved from betrayal, hyperawareness, and emotional armor thicker than steel. To understand the people who hate people, you must first understand the wounds they refuse to show. Most people who develop a deep dislike for humanity do not arrive there suddenly. It is not an innate trait, but a slow, often painful evolution. It begins in childhood, in subtle fractures that may go unnoticed by others, but are seared into the psyche of the individual. A child who experiences emotional neglect learns early that their needs, feelings, and vulnerabilities are inconsequential. Love is not freely given, and attention is inconsistent, teaching the mind that relying on others is not only disappointing but dangerous. In homes where care is conditional, where approval is measured and carefully rationed, a child internalizes the belief that human relationships are transactions, mechanisms of control rather than sources of genuine connection. If those who should protect and nurture fail, the outside world offers little hope of anything different. Betrayal from those closest, whether in the form of broken promises, public humiliation, or outright rejection, leaves an imprint that shapes the fundamental assumptions of how one engages with others as the child grows into adolescence. These early wounds intersect with social realities. Peer interactions become both a proving ground and a minefield. The adolescent who experiences bullying, social rejection, or subtle forms of manipulation begins to notice patterns in human behavior that are less than flattering. The cruelty, self-interest, and duplicity observed in these formative years become evidence supporting a growing internal narrative. People are unreliable, often cruel, and emotionally dangerous. Romantic experiences, however fleeting, can reinforce this perception when vulnerability is met with betrayal, rejection, or ridicule. What begins as the sting of personal pain gradually evolves into a broader judgment about the human species as a whole. These experiences are compounded when the individual is naturally more sensitive, more reflective, or more perceptive than others. A person attuned to the motives and inconsistencies of those around them sees not isolated failures, but a pattern of fundamental human flaw. The same situations that might be shrugged off by others accumulate, shaping a worldview centered on suspicion and caution. It is crucial to understand that not everyone exposed to neglect, betrayal, or rejection becomes a misanthrope. Certain psychological traits, heightened sensitivity, deep introspection, analytical thinking, and a preference for self-reliance, amplify the impact of negative experiences. Highly sensitive individuals experience the pain of betrayal more intensely, while those who analyze social interactions deeply learn to recognize patterns of deceit and self-interest early. Introversion can compound this tendency. The introverted mind finds social interactions draining, and when paired with a keen awareness of others' flaws, solitude becomes a relief rather than a punishment. Over time, these tendencies intersect with lived experiences, creating a fertile ground for misanthropy. The psychological transition from disappointment to hatred is gradual. Early mistrust evolves into guardedness, then detachment, until the individual begins to construct a coherent internal narrative. People are inherently flawed, untrustworthy, and often harmful. Emotional numbing follows as a form of protection, insulating the mind from further disappointment. With each interaction that confirms these expectations, the narrative strengthens, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Withdrawal from social engagement, avoidance of vulnerability, and heightened skepticism act as both symptom and reinforcement of the emerging worldview. The individual begins to interpret every interaction through a lens that highlights selfishness, hypocrisy, and betrayal, often exaggerating or generalizing behaviors to fit the internal belief system. Environmental and cultural factors further support the formation of this perspective. Exposure to societal cruelty, systemic injustice, and daily examples of manipulation or exploitation feeds the growing conviction that human behavior is largely self-serving. Social media, in particular, amplifies this perception, providing constant evidence of dishonesty, cruelty, and the prioritization of self-interest over empathy. In a competitive world, where individuals are often rewarded for cunning, strategic thinking, or ruthless efficiency, the misanthrope observes a reflection of their early lessons on a larger scale. People cannot be trusted, not because of personal misfortune alone, but because the structures of society reward behavior that justifies their mistrust. By the time misanthropy solidifies, it has transformed from a defensive reaction into a defining characteristic of identity. What began as protection against hurt becomes a worldview and a mode of functioning. The mind constructs a psychological fortress where emotional walls, cognitive filters, and behavioral patterns work in unison to preserve safety and maintain control. Intimacy is avoided, trust is rationed, and interactions are carefully filtered. The individual no longer experiences hatred merely as a response to personal experiences. It is an organizing principle, a lens through which all social reality is interpreted. Hatred becomes rational, predictable, and, in many ways, comforting. It provides a sense of order in a world perceived as chaotic and dangerous, a way to maintain emotional equilibrium in the face of repeated disappointment. In this sense, misanthropy is both survival mechanism and identity. It is an intricate product of early emotional trauma, adolescent social learning, personality predispositions, and environmental reinforcement. Understanding the origins of those who hate people is not merely an exercise in curiosity. It is a glimpse into a mind shaped by survival instincts, hardened by repeated violations, and structured around a careful, deliberate interpretation of human behavior. Their disdain is rarely random or whimsical. It is the outcome of psychological processes designed to protect, predict, and, ultimately, shield the individual from the vulnerabilities that come with trusting others. In studying these minds, one observes not cruelty for its own sake, but a deep, enduring response to the consistent failure of others to meet the expectations of care, honesty, and respect, expectations that most take for granted until they are systematically denied. The minds of those who hate people operate in a landscape shaped as much by caution as by perception. It is a terrain of heightened awareness, relentless analysis, and constant evaluation of others' motives. This cognitive architecture, what one might call a mental armor, does not emerge spontaneously. It is carefully constructed over years of observation, betrayal, and personal disappointment. To the misanthrope, every interaction carries risk, every word contains potential deception, and every gesture can conceal intent. Their thought patterns are not merely cynical. They are strategic, defensive, and calibrated to anticipate the worst in others while minimizing vulnerability to harm. The core of this thinking is an acute sensitivity to human behavior. They are observers of the subtle signals, the inconsistencies in tone, expression, and intention that others overlook. Whereas most individuals navigate social spaces with assumptions of basic decency, those who hate people approach interactions with suspicion. Every smile, every compliment, and every act of kindness is scrutinized. They ask not, "Why are people kind?" but "What are they trying to gain?" This analytical vigilance is exhausting to outsiders, but to the misanthrope, it is essential for emotional survival. Their minds are organized to detect patterns of selfishness, hypocrisy, and manipulation. A minor betrayal is not dismissed as a singular event. It becomes part of a broader matrix of evidence demonstrating the unreliability of humanity. Over time, this pattern recognition solidifies into a mental framework where assumptions about others are overwhelmingly negative, yet internally consistent. Each observation is cataloged, each disappointment reinforced, and each interaction filtered through a lens that magnifies flaws and suppresses virtues. In effect, their cognitive style transforms experience into a predictive system. By expecting deceit, harm, or exploitation, they can avoid it, or at least minimize its impact. This hyperawareness does not exist in isolation. It is accompanied by defensive pessimism. The misanthrope anticipates betrayal, disappointment, and failure in almost every social context. Relationships are evaluated before they begin, workplaces scrutinized for hidden agendas, and casual acquaintances weighed for potential risk. By assuming the worst, they maintain a sense of control over uncertainty. This pessimism is not mere negativity. It is a coping mechanism refined to ensure self-preservation. In the mind of the misanthrope, expecting the worst is rational, protective, and, paradoxically, reassuring. Emotional regulation is another key component of their cognitive armor. To engage fully with people is to open oneself to harm, and those who hate people have learned to numb or regulate their emotional responses to avoid repeated trauma. Empathy is selective, often reserved for animals, abstract principles, or a very narrow circle of trusted individuals. In social encounters, they maintain a degree of detachment, observing and interpreting without emotional investment. This distance preserves them from the pain of unmet expectations, allowing their analytical faculties to operate without interference from transient emotions. The misanthrope's thinking also includes a form of moral calibration. They are acutely aware of the gap between the ideals they internalize and the realities they observe in others. Hypocrisy, cruelty, and opportunism are magnified in their perception because the contrast with expected behavior is sharper. In this way, moral sensitivity fuels their mistrust. They do not merely recognize human flaws, they measure them against a personal standard, and the discrepancy breeds resentment, alienation, and, ultimately, hate. Their mental armor is adaptive but comes with costs. It isolates them socially, reinforcing a feedback loop where distance from others confirms the correctness of their worldview. Interpersonal engagement is reduced not only to protect themselves, but also because they have learned that relationships rarely yield proportional rewards for the investment required. This cognitive strategy is efficient. By expecting betrayal, analyzing motives, and regulating emotions, they reduce exposure to harm. Yet it also deepens solitude and alienation, as others perceive them as cold, distant, or unapproachable. The misanthrope's thought patterns extend beyond interpersonal interactions into broader societal interpretations. They generalize human behavior from patterns they observe locally, extrapolating systemic flaws from individual instances. Corruption, exploitation, dishonesty, and cruelty are interpreted not as anomalies, but as inherent traits of humanity. Their worldview is thus both analytical and absolute. They do not merely react to experiences. They predict, interpret, and classify human behavior according to a framework that prioritizes caution, survival, and control. Yet within this rigid mental structure, subtle forms of creativity and strategy often emerge. They may manipulate social situations not from malice, but from calculated preservation. Negotiations, social gatherings, and professional interactions are approached like tactical exercises, with outcomes anticipated and risks minimized. Their intelligence, observation, and strategic thinking are sharpened by necessity, honed by repeated exposure to the unpredictability and unreliability of others. It is a paradoxical competence. The very traits that isolate them are also those that make them highly perceptive, discerning, and, in some contexts, remarkably effective. In essence, the misanthrope's cognitive armor is both shield and lens. It protects them from harm while simultaneously shaping their perception of reality. Their worldview, one of distrust, skepticism, and selective engagement, is a rational, albeit rigid, response to accumulated experiences. It is not born from inherent cruelty but from the meticulous, adaptive structuring of thought to survive in a world perceived as threatening, duplicitous, and emotionally perilous. Understanding this architecture of thought requires acknowledging the precision, consistency, and defensiveness underlying behaviors often dismissed as mere cynicism or bitterness. To observe a mind that hates people is to witness a mind that has learned to anticipate betrayal, regulate vulnerability, and interpret every interaction as a potential threat. Their intelligence, perception, and strategic thinking are inseparable from their worldview, and the cognitive armor they construct is as functional as it is isolating. In studying this, one sees not a simple refusal of connection, but a deliberate, reasoned, and often painfully necessary system of survival, a mental fortress built to withstand the emotional unpredictability of other humans. This framework is what allows them to navigate a world they perceive as dangerous while preserving the psychological integrity they have painstakingly assembled. The behavior of those who hate people is a direct extension of the cognitive architecture they have meticulously constructed. It is one thing to think the world is untrustworthy, but it is another to live in it while maintaining that belief. Every action, every interaction, every withdrawal is a reflection of calculated survival, shaped by years of observation, disappointment, and emotional self-preservation. Their behavior is not impulsive or random. It is deliberate, guided by internalized rules designed to reduce exposure to harm and maximize emotional control. For the misanthrope, social engagement is transactional in the strictest sense, not in the economic sense, but in the emotional calculus. Every encounter is evaluated for risk, benefit, and authenticity. Casual pleasantries, forced smiles, and empty gestures are seen as potential threats to their well-being. Small inconsistencies in speech or behavior are magnified, cataloged, and interpreted as evidence of duplicity or hidden agendas. In this way, their outward coldness is not a symptom of cruelty, but a shield against the vulnerabilities inherent in interpersonal relationships. They have learned that to engage fully with others is to invite pain, and the avoidance of engagement is a rational strategy for self-preservation. This behavioral pattern is reinforced through repetition. Withdrawal from social environments reduces immediate risk, and each negative experience that follows isolation confirms the correctness of the strategy. Over time, this creates a self-sustaining loop. Detachment ensures safety. Safety reinforces detachment, and detachment confirms the necessity of mistrust. Relationships are entered into cautiously, often only after extensive observation, and even then, boundaries are rigidly maintained. Emotional intimacy is granted sparingly, if at all, and only to those who have proven their reliability beyond reasonable doubt. Even among these rare individuals, the misanthrope maintains a measure of distance, a silent guard against the unpredictability of human behavior. Their social behavior is also shaped by an acute awareness of human flaws. The misanthrope is particularly sensitive to dishonesty, manipulation, and hypocrisy, perceiving these traits where others might see harmless mistakes or social nuance. This heightened perception often alienates them from peers, who may misinterpret their vigilance as paranoia, aloofness, or arrogance. Yet, from the misanthrope's perspective, these traits are rational and necessary. They are a defense against a world that has repeatedly proven to be emotionally unsafe. In this sense, their apparent coldness is not a moral failing but a sophisticated, adaptive strategy. Isolation, while protective, carries its own psychological consequences. The misanthrope becomes increasingly self-reliant, drawing emotional sustenance from introspection, solitary pursuits, or controlled relationships. They often cultivate intellectual or creative endeavors that do not require compromise or trust, finding solace in activities where human unpredictability is minimized. This creates a duality. The misanthrope is simultaneously highly capable and deeply isolated, intellectually alert but socially restricted. Every action reinforces the mental model that other humans are best kept at a distance, further entrenching their worldview at times. Their behavior can be misunderstood as hostility, when in reality it is structured avoidance. They may engage in social interactions with precision, carefully managing what they reveal and observing what others disclose. They are capable of charm, humor, and warmth, but these are tools employed selectively, never indiscriminately. The misanthrope measures the cost of every engagement, calculating potential exposure against emotional need. The majority of the time, emotional need is minimized, leaving calculated observation as the dominant mode of interaction. Their professional lives, too, reflect this behavioral pattern. In workplaces, the misanthrope may appear competent, detached, or even intimidating. They observe colleagues meticulously, identify weaknesses or hidden motives, and protect themselves from manipulation. Collaboration is approached cautiously, with clear boundaries and minimal reliance on others. They excel in roles that reward independent thought, strategic planning, or analytical insight, while avoiding environments that demand excessive trust or emotional vulnerability. This behavioral calibration is a testament to their acute understanding of social dynamics, albeit filtered through a lens of caution and skepticism. Even casual social interactions are interpreted and evaluated. Small gestures, offhand comments, and minor inconsistencies are all processed as potential threats or evidence of human unreliability. This vigilance extends to both strangers and acquaintances, shaping a behavior pattern that prioritizes detachment over connection. In public spaces, the misanthrope often moves silently, observing rather than participating, analyzing rather than engaging. They are acutely aware of social norms and expectations, yet often reject them, finding the conventions of civility insufficient to guarantee emotional safety. Despite this pervasive detachment, the misanthrope is not necessarily indifferent to human suffering. They may feel empathy selectively, particularly toward those who cannot exploit or betray them. Animals, abstract concepts, or vulnerable individuals often evoke genuine concern, demonstrating that their hatred is not indiscriminate but targeted. It is not a lack of emotional capacity, but a strategic allocation of it. Emotional energy is conserved, invested only where it cannot be weaponized against them. Over time, these behavioral strategies coalesce into a consistent social pattern. The misanthrope avoids emotional vulnerability, engages selectively, observes meticulously, and interprets human behavior with unflinching realism. Their actions are governed by an internal logic designed to minimize exposure to harm and maximize control over interactions. This behavioral consistency reinforces their worldview, confirming that mistrust and detachment are not merely defensive tactics, but valid responses to repeated evidence of human unreliability. Ultimately, the social behavior of the misanthrope is a direct manifestation of their cognitive and emotional architecture. It is not simply withdrawal. It is a sophisticated system of self-protection, observation, and calculation. It is a life lived with vigilance, a careful calibration of engagement, and a continuous assessment of risk. In this way, The misanthrope navigates a world they perceive as unpredictable and emotionally dangerous while maintaining the psychological integrity they have painstakingly developed. Their behavior is at once a survival mechanism, a reflection of experience, and an embodiment of a worldview forged in the crucible of disappointment, mistrust, and careful observation.